The man in the dark coat stood outside the bakery window for 3 full minutes before Mira Alvarez noticed him. He wasn't looking at the pastries. He was looking at the eviction notice taped to the inside of the glass, the one she'd tried to hide behind a paper cutout of a rolling pin. If you've ever stood in a kitchen at 2 in the morning fighting to save something you loved, tell me where you're watching from tonight, because this story is for you. 3 weeks earlier, none of this had started yet. Mira was 29 years old, and she measured her life in flour and butter the way other people measured theirs in years. Sweetgrass Bakery had belonged to her father for 22 years before it belonged to her, and in the 8 months since his funeral, she had learned that grief has a smell. It smells like cinnamon at midnight, when sleep won't come, and the only thing that quiets her mind is her hands moving through dough. She was curvy, soft in the places her mother used to poke fun at, and she had long since stopped explaining her body to anyone who hadn't earned the right to an opinion about it. The bakery sat on the corner of Halden and 9th, its windows still fogged gold at 2 in the morning, because Mira couldn't sleep in the apartment upstairs without the oven running somewhere beneath her. She was icing a batch of lemon rolls when the bell over the door rang, sharp and unexpected in the empty street. She looked up, flour dusting her forearms, and found a man filling the doorway like he'd been built for it. He was tall in a way that made the low bakery ceiling feel smaller, his shoulders set beneath a charcoal coat that didn't belong on this side of town at this hour. His jaw was sharp, his eyes a pale, watchful gray, and there was a stillness to him that reminded Mira of a held breath. "You're open," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Technically, I'm not supposed to be. Mira wiped her hands on her apron, more out of habit than necessity. But the ovens don't know that. He didn't smile, not exactly, but something in his face loosened a fraction. His gaze moved over the display case, over trays of lemon rolls and cardamom buns cooling on wire racks, and settled, finally, on her. "What's good tonight?" "Everything," she said. "I made it." That earned her the closest thing to a real smile she would see from him for several more nights. He bought 2 lemon rolls and a coffee he didn't touch, and he sat at the small table by the window with his back to the wall, the way a man sits when he needs to see every door in a room. He didn't talk much. He didn't need to. When he left, he told her his name was Roman, nothing else, and the bell rang again behind him, and Mira stood there a long moment before she remembered to breathe. He came back the next night. And the night after that. Mira's sister Delia called her every Sunday, always with the same question. "Are you seeing anyone?" And every Sunday, Mira gave the same answer. "I see a man at 2 in the morning who buys lemon rolls and doesn't say much." Delia would laugh and tell her that didn't count as seeing someone, and Mira would agree, and then think about Roman's hands around a coffee cup for the rest of the week anyway. By the 4th visit, Mira had stopped pretending she baked at 2 in the morning purely because of insomnia. She baked because it was the only hour of the day when nobody could see her hands shake. The bakery's finances were a slow-motion collapse. She hadn't found the courage to name it out loud, not even to her own sister. Her father, in the last 2 years of his life, had borrowed against the building to cover a bad batch of ovens and a worse batch of medical bills. And the loan had come from a man named Silas Voss, whose interest rates existed in a legal gray zone that lawyers billed $400 an hour to explain, and still couldn't fix. The notice in the window wasn't the first one. It was the 3rd. She had tried, in the early months, to fix it the ordinary way. She'd sat across from a loan officer at the credit union on 9th Street. Her father's ledgers stacked in front of her like evidence in a trial she was already losing, and been told gently that a bakery running on grief and good intentions wasn't a bankable asset. She'd tried selling her car. She'd tried a crowdfunding page that raised $600 and a wave of secondhand pity from people she barely knew. Nothing had touched the number that mattered. $11,000 sat over her life like weather that refused to break. Roman noticed things. He always had. It was, in a very literal sense, how he'd survived 36 years in a world that chewed up men less careful than him. He noticed the calculator Mira kept tucked under the register, the one she reached for every night around 3 when she thought no one was watching. He noticed the particular quality of her silence on nights the mail had come. He noticed that she never once asked him what he did for a living, though anyone with functioning eyes could see the answer wasn't accounting. On the 6th night, he sat at his usual table and watched her work in silence for nearly 20 minutes before he spoke. "You alphabetize your spice jars," he said, "but you keep the vanilla out of order, right next to the flour. Every night." Mira blinked, caught off guard. "It was my dad's habit. He said vanilla was the soul of the bakery, so it didn't belong filled with everything else." She hadn't meant to say that much. It surprised her how easily it came out around him. He sounds like he knew what he was doing. He did. Until the end, when he didn't. She hadn't meant to say that either. "You're doing the math wrong," Roman said one night a few days later, nodding at the calculator she'd forgotten to hide behind the register. "Excuse me? You keep re-entering the same number. You already know the answer. You just don't want it to be true." She should have been offended. Instead, something in her chest cracked open. Small and sudden, the way it does when a stranger says the one true thing nobody close to you has had the nerve to say. "The bakery owes $11,000 to a man who charges interest like it's a hobby," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "I have $4,000 in savings, a dead father's dream, and a landlord who's already rented my father's old office to a nail salon in his head." Roman was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. "Who is he?" "The lender. Silas Voss." She said the name tasted bad. "He was polite when he handed my father the check. He is not polite now." Something shifted behind Roman's eyes, brief and dangerous, gone before Mira could name it. "I know the name," he said simply, and offered nothing more that night. If you're new here, subscribe now, because the next part of Mira and Roman's story is the reason this channel exists, and you will not want to miss what happens when a man like Roman decides to look into a name like Silas Voss. He kept coming. 2 in the morning became a fixed point in both their lives, an hour that belonged to no one else. He learned that she hummed off key while she piped frosting, that she cried during sad commercials but never during sad movies, that she still kept her father's rolling pin mounted on the wall like a relic because throwing it away had felt like losing him twice. She learned that Roman's stillness wasn't emptiness. It was armor, built by a childhood he mentioned only once, in careful fragments, about a father who ran men the way other fathers ran hardware stores, and a mother who left before Roman turned 10 and never once looked back. She learned he didn't sleep well either, that the two of them had simply found each other in the 1 hour when the rest of the world agreed to look away. One night, near closing, she caught him staring at the framed photo behind the register, her father in a flour-dusted apron, grinning at the camera the way he grinned at everything. "You have his eyes," Roman said quietly. "Everyone says that." Mira wiped down the counter without looking up. "I used to hate it. Now I think it's the nicest thing anyone can tell me." There was a night, the 7th, when a sudden downpour flooded the street outside, and Roman simply stayed past closing, helping her stack chairs and mop flour off the tile without being asked, his charcoal coat draped over the back of a chair like he'd forgotten. For an hour. That he was supposed to be somewhere important, she asked him. Finally, the question she'd been circling for days. "Why do you keep coming back here, Roman? A man like you could eat anywhere in this city." He considered the question longer than it deserved, Because for 1 hour a night, nobody wants anything from me except honest conversation and a lemon roll, he said. You have no idea how rare that is in my life. That's a low bar. You'd be surprised how few people clear it. She laughed, and he watched her laugh the way a man watches something he's afraid to want too badly, and neither of them said anything else about it that night, though both of them carried the conversation home. Dance with me, he said, on the 9th night, apropos of nothing, while a tinny radio played something slow from the shelf behind the register. Mira laughed, startled. Here? Now? I have flour on my shirt. One dance. His voice had dropped into something quieter, something that made the back of her neck warm. I'm not asking twice. She untied her apron and let him pull her into the narrow space between the display case and the ovens, his hand settling at her waist like it had always belonged there, and for 3 minutes, the eviction notice, and the calculator, and $11,000 of debt simply ceased to exist. She would replay that dance for the rest of her life, the warmth of the ovens at her back, the low hum of a stranger who no longer felt like a stranger, the way he'd looked at her like she was something worth being careful with. When the song ended, he didn't step back right away. He just looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, the stillness in his eyes looked less like armor and more like want. It didn't last. 3 nights later, Roman texted her at 11 that he'd been pulled into a meeting across town and might be late. Mira told herself it didn't matter, that she'd baked alone for years before him and could do it again for 1 night. But the bakery felt different without him in the corner seat. Bigger somehow. And colder. The string of small sounds she usually ignored. The hum of the walk-in cooler. The tick of the old radiator. Suddenly loud enough to notice. She kept glancing at the door. She told herself she wasn't waiting for him. She was lying. The bell over the door rang at 2:47 a.m., and it wasn't Roman. 2 men walked in wearing the kind of smiles that never reached their eyes, and Mira knew, with the instant clarity of a rabbit hearing a hawk's shadow across the grass, exactly who had sent them. The taller one flipped the sign on the door to close without asking. Mister, Voss wanted us to remind you the notice period ends Friday, he said, strolling behind the counter like he owned it, running one finger along the edge of a cooling tray. He also wanted us to mention that he's heard you've had company lately. Late-night company. Mister, Voss doesn't love competition for his collateral. Mira's blood went cold. This has nothing to do with anyone else. Everything has to do with everyone else, the shorter man said pleasantly, and picked up her father's rolling pin off the wall, turning it over in his hands, like a threat, wearing a smile. Pretty little bakery like this. It would be a shame if it burned before Friday instead of just closing quietly. Her hands were shaking so hard, she had to press them flat against the counter to hide it. She thought of every version of bravery she'd ever seen in movies, and found none of them inside her. Put that back, she said anyway, because silence felt worse than fear. Feisty, the taller man said, amused, leaning both elbows on the counter like he had all night. Your father was smarter than you. He knew when to stay quiet and just pay what he owed. My father is dead, Mira said, her voice cracking despite herself. And he never owed anywhere near what Voss says he does. Numbers are numbers, sweetheart, he shrugged, unbothered by the correction, and reached for a lemon roll off the tray without asking, taking a bite as though the shop already belonged to him. Whatever the paper says, that's what's true. Friday, the shorter man set the rolling pin down at last, only to pick up her father's photo instead, turning the frame over in his hands with deliberate slowness, watching her face for the flinch he knew was coming. The taller man laughed, low and unbothered, and set a folded paper on the counter, like a receipt for a debt she'd never agreed to owe twice over. Friday, he repeated, softer now, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. The door hadn't finished swinging shut behind them before Roman was through it. Mira never saw him arrive. 1 second, the two men were laughing at their own joke on their way out, and the next Roman had the shorter one pinned against the display case hard enough to crack the glass. His voice a low and terrible thing Mira had never heard from him before. "You touched her rolling pin," he said, as if that alone were the unforgivable offense, and something about the flat, total calm of it frightened her more than shouting ever could. The men left bleeding, and considerably less confident, scrambling for the door the way men do when they've suddenly remembered they are, in fact, replaceable. Roman didn't chase them. For a long moment he simply stood there in the wreckage of the display case, breathing hard, his eyes still carrying the flat and terrible calm Mira had never seen from him before, and she realized, watching him, that the stillness she'd mistaken for gentleness all along had another face entirely, one that had likely ended careers and occasionally lives. He turned to Mira instead, his hands gentle, even as his knuckles split open, and for the first time, he told her everything. His last name was Ashford. That the empire his father built, and he now ran controlled half the shipping contracts on this side of the river. That Silas Voss was a small-time predatory lender who'd been quietly buying up debt from grieving families for years. Protected by a handful of dirty cops Roman had spent 6 years trying to expose through channels far quieter than violence. 6 years, Mira repeated, sitting down hard in the chair by the window. You've been building a case against him for 6 years, and he still sent men to threaten me over $11,000. Voss doesn't know I've been building anything, Roman said. To him, I'm just a man who buys lemon rolls at 2 in the morning. That's about to change, and I need you to understand what that means. Once I move against him openly, there's no quiet way back. He'll come at both of us with everything he has left. I should have told you sooner, he said, sitting across from her at the little table by the window, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me right now. I'm not scared of you, Mira said, and meant it, even as her hands were still trembling from the men who had just left. I'm scared for you. Voss won't stop because you're rich and dangerous. Men like that only stop when they have nothing left to threaten anyone with. Then, we take away everything he has to threaten you with, Roman said. His own people didn't approve. 2 days later, his second in command, a broad, gray-haired man named Dmitri, who'd worked for Roman's father before he worked for Roman, showed up at the bakery an hour before dawn, uninvited, and sat across from Mira like he was sizing up a threat instead of a woman covered in flour. You know what you've started, Dmitri said to Roman, not unkindly, but not gently either. A man in your position doesn't fall for a baker on the wrong side of town. It makes you predictable. Predictable men get buried. I'm aware of the risk, Roman said, his voice flat and final, in a way that ended the conversation before Mira could decide whether to be offended. He's not predictable, Mira said anyway, because someone talking about her like she wasn't in the room had never sat well with her. He's just done pretending he doesn't want something for himself for once. That's not the same thing as being weak. Dmitri studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes, and then, unexpectedly, he almost smiled. No, he said slowly. I suppose it isn't. He left without another word, but Roman told her later it was the closest thing to approval the old man had ever given anyone. It was Mira, not Roman, who found the answer 3 nights later, buried in a shoebox of her father's paperwork she'd been too heartbroken to open until now. She sat cross-legged on the bakery floor at midnight, papers spread around her like a snowfall, and something on the 3rd page made her go very still. Voss's original loan documents didn't match the numbers on the most recent notices. The interest rate had quietly changed twice without a single new signature authorizing it, a violation so basic and so provable that Mira, who'd done her father's book since she was 17 years old, recognized it the moment she saw it stacked side by side. Her hands trembled again, but this time it wasn't fear. She had almost missed it. The first 2 times through the box, her eyes had skimmed past the numbers, the way grief makes you skim past anything that hurts to look at directly. It was only on the 3rd pass, cross-referencing the original signing date against the payment schedule stapled behind it, that the discrepancy jumped out at her. Small and undeniable, a single decimal shift that had quietly doubled what her father owed over 18 months without a signature anywhere in sight. Her father had taught her, at 17, sitting at this exact counter, that the numbers never lie even when the people behind them do. She hadn't understood what he meant until tonight. He inflated it, she said when Roman arrived that night and found her still sitting on the floor. Illegally, I have. Proof. Actual, notarized, dated proof. Right here. Roman knelt beside her, scanning the pages twice, then looked at her with something fierce and proud moving behind his gray eyes. That's not just proof, he said. That's a weapon. And it's yours, not mine. You built this, Mira, not me. Together they took it to the one person Voss couldn't buy, a state financial regulator Roman had been quietly feeding evidence to for years. A woman with tired eyes and a spine of iron who took one look at the altered contracts and started making phone calls before Mira had finished her coffee. Voss's operation collapsed within the month, buried under fraud charges that had nothing to do with Mafia politics and everything to do with a baker's daughter who refused to let a dead man's dream be stolen from her twice. The debt was voided in full. The bakery, for the first time in almost a year, belonged entirely to Mira, free and clear, her name and no one else's on the deed. The regulator's office called it one of the cleanest predatory lending cases they'd built in a decade. Reporters wanted a quote from the young baker who'd found the paper trail no one else had noticed. Mira gave them one sentence, standing behind her own counter in her own bakery. My father taught me to always double-check the numbers. Turns out that's the only inheritance that mattered. Delia cried when she saw it printed in the local paper and called Mira twice that night just to hear her sister's voice, steady and unafraid for the first time in a year. On the night the papers came through, Roman found her exactly where he'd found her the very first time, icing lemon rolls at 2 a.m, except this time there was no eviction notice in the window, only string lights she'd hung that afternoon out of pure, stubborn joy. You saved your own bakery, he said, leaning in the doorway the way he had on the first night, watching her the way he always watched her, like she was the only steady thing in a world built on shifting ground. You carried a lot more than papers, Mira said, and this time it was her hands that reached for him first, flour dust and all, closing the distance between them before he could. He pulled her in, without a word, and the old radio on the shelf found the same slow song it always seemed to find, and this time there was no debt hanging over them, no danger waiting outside the door, only 2 people who had found each other in the one honest hour of the night. They danced between the display case and the ovens, her cheek against his chest, his hand warm at her waist. And Mira thought that maybe grief didn't have to smell like loneliness forever. Sometimes it smelled like cinnamon, and second chances, and a man who kept coming back for one more dance. Months later, the little table by the window would still be Roman's table, and the string lights never came down, and every night at 2 a.m, the bell over the door would ring, and Mira would look up already smiling before she even saw who it was. Delia visited on a Sunday that spring and found Roman elbow deep in flour, badly failing to shape a batch of dinner rolls under Mira's patient instruction, his charcoal coat hung on the same hook where her father's apron used to hang. So this is the 2 a.m. Man, Delia said, arms crossed, fighting a smile. You didn't mention he can't bake. He's improving, Mira said. I am standing right here, Roman said, deadpan, and Delia laughed so hard she had to sit down, and for the first time since their father died, the bakery on the corner of Halden and 9th felt entirely, uncomplicatedly full again. Dimitri still came by most Fridays for a lemon roll, gruffer than anyone else who walked through the door, but always the first to ask how the ovens were running. Silas Voss's name never came up again. Not once, not even in passing, as if the whole city had simply agreed to let it sink beneath the surface where it belonged. And every night, without fail, when the last customer had gone and the street outside had gone quiet, Roman would set down whatever he was doing, cross the narrow space between the display case and the ovens, and hold out his hand. One dance, he'd say, every single time, like it was the first time all over again. And every single time, Mira untied her apron and let him pull her close, the ovens warm at her back, the string lights glowing above them, and the whole aching. Hard-won life they'd built together, humming quietly between them like the last note of a song neither of them ever wanted to end. If Mira and Roman's story kept you up past your own 2 in the morning, hit that like button before you go. We're just getting started on the next chapter of their life together, and you will not want to miss it, so make sure you're subscribed and ready when it drops.